Welcome to our public program on the state of U.S.-India relations. Our guest speakers from India, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, and our moderator, Sumir Chadha. We have 144 people signed up with us tonight. In our audience, we welcome our chair, Ken Wilcox, at least 17 board members, groundbreaker and innovator members, our global community friends, and executives from Chevron. Chevron is our event sponsor, and they have been longtime supporters of Asia Society. We thank Kurt Glaubitz, the General Manager of Corporate Affairs at Chevron. We thank him for his leadership and dedication to our work. We've really been looking forward to this program, especially Rex Laui on our team, who has helped make this program possible. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of the Northern California Center. Our format for today, I will introduce Sumir, who's going to moderate. He's going to introduce our guest speaker. They'll have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. If you have a question, go ahead and put that in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Sumir's going to be monitoring those throughout the program. All speaker bios are on our website. They're also in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. This event is on the record, and we are recording. We have an hour for this program. We'll end at 7 p.m. Pacific. Then we're going to go to a VIP reception for our sponsors. So we look forward to seeing those of you there. A few words about our moderator, Sumir Chadha. Sumir is co-founder and managing director of WestBridge Capital out of Silicon Valley. He's been investing in India for over 2 decades. He serves on many boards, including Star Health, Aptus, and the American Indian Foundation, as well as our board in Northern California at Asia Society. Sumir was previously managing director of Sequoia Capital India. He worked at Goldman Sachs and at McKinsey. He has degrees from Harvard and Princeton, and that is where he also established a center for Global India. Sumir, thank you so much for your terrific support, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the wonderful work at the Asia Society that enables such great discussions. It's really an honor, Dr. Subramanian, to have you here, such an eminent person before this group today, so thank you for being here. I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Subramanian. He's India's Chief Economic Advisor and a leading expert on economic policy. He's a PhD from Chicago Booth, as well as a top-ranking IIT, IIM alumnus. And Dr. Subramanian has written a path-breaking economic survey commending ethical wealth creation in India. He's also been key behind a lot of the very exciting government reforms that have happened recently that I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing more about. And it's a real pleasure to have him here today. And with that, let me turn to Dr. Subramanian and have him make his opening remarks. And subsequent to that, Dr. Subramanian, I have a few questions for you, and we'll open it up to the audience for questions. So please, Dr. Subramanian, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Samir, and a very good evening to all the eminent ladies and gentlemen in California. So, my perspective on Indo-US relations is both personal and professional. I must first acknowledge that the United States funded my higher education, my PhD, by giving me a full fellowship. And so I remain deeply indebted to the American public for providing me the opportunity to learn at possibly the temple of capitalism, University of Chicago. So my remarks, I'm going to keep it very short, but I'm going to focus primarily on the economic aspects. You all are amidst significant change, and I'm sure you all will be able to speak much better about what that change portends for Indo-US relations. But what I would want to highlight to you is the change that is happening in India, especially on the economic side, and what that means, therefore, for Indo-US relations, especially on the economic front. Samir mentioned about this economic survey on ethical wealth creation that I had the privilege of authoring for the Government of India. The economic survey, for those of you who may not be familiar, is the flagship publication of the Office of the Chief Economic Advisor. It gets tabled in the Indian Parliament by the Honorable Finance Minister a day before the federal budget is presented. Over the years, people like Dr. Kaushik Basu, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, Dr. Untitled Subramanian have really elevated the economic survey as possibly the economic event of the calendar year, because this is and not my words, but words of a Harvard economist who actually I had the privilege of knowing, Professor Sunstein. He said that the economic survey possibly is the most economically rigorous document by any government in the world. So, one got the platform to make a case for something that I think is extremely critical in the Indian context. I'll give you a little bit of history. I'm sure many of you are familiar. India started out being a socialistic economy, where wealth and wealth creators were just seen as necessary evil, not ones to be admired, admired about. And that's where I must acknowledge the intellectual debt from spending a decade in the United States, where the American dream is one of somebody who actually goes from rags to riches, or on his or her own ability, and just his pure merit makes it big. And being wealthy is an important dimension in that. While we had a socialistic past, our very rich and long history actually was one that commended wealth creation, and that is something that we start the arguments in the economic survey with. That research by George Madison, published in some of the leading journals in economics, showed that for 3/4 of known economic history, India was the leading economic power. And I think it's useful to just give some perspective. The United States today is undisputably the largest economic power. If you look at the contribution to world GDP by the United States, at its peak, it has been about 15-16% to world GDP. And this has been there for about a half a century. I'm rounding up numbers just so that you can, get the perspective. Now, half a century, about 15% of GDP at its peak. In contrast, for 17 and a half centuries, till 1750 AD, India accounted for at least 33% of world GDP. So half a century versus 17 and a half centuries, and 15% maximum versus 33% minimum. Now you actually do the numbers, do the comparison, and then you'll get a sense of the economic prosperity. Now you will acknowledge that such kind of prosperity, as it is with the United States as well, does not come about with just by pure accident. It comes because of the quality of ideas, the economic ideas that lead to such dominance. And that is where, what we did is to combine modern economics with ancient economic thinking. The Arthashastra, which is written in Sanskrit by Kautilya, and Tirukkural, written in Tamil, my native language, as disparate scripts as those, commend wealth creation, especially ethical wealth creation. And they also talk about the invisible hand of markets without using that language. They use the language of trade and say that trade is what is particularly important for economic prosperity. They also talk about the idea of ethical wealth creation, and that's where the inspiration is drawn from. And from my vantage point, having actually read all the literature in modern economics, and also the literature that we have been endowed with in India, I've had the privilege of combining both, because it is important for the Indians to know that this idea of wealth creation as something that should be pursued is not anathema to the Indian psyche. In fact, it is something that was worshipped. If one reads our scriptures, there are 4 noble pursuits, and these are Sanskrit words that are used, which is dharma, arth, kama, moksha, which basically means, being righteous, having desires, pursuing wealth, and also pursuing liberation. Those were talked about as the 4 noble pursuits, among which wealth was considered a noble pursuit. It is just the unfortunate, events of about half a century where we actually started considering wealth and wealth creation as something, as a necessary evil. So this is in some sense going back to our roots, which is something that therefore has really appealed to the, to the citizens and to the political establishment. And that, with all humility, I would like to state that that has been partly the reason for the reforms that are focused on, enabling the private sector, enabling, the opening up of markets. For instance, there have been a lot of factor market reforms, labor reforms, and, for want of time, I don't want to go into the detail, but these are seminal because, the labor reforms were talked about in 1991 when India started its liberalization. It was in fact a conditionality in the loan that was given by the International Monetary Fund, and yet it never got done for 3 decades. And now it has been done. Similarly, the agricultural reforms, and I will have a just 30-second comment on that, given some of the protests that we might be observing. The reforms in terms of the space for the private sector, policy focused on private sector. For a country that gave the commanding heights of the economy to the public sector in its first industrial policy, this time now, actually, the policy that has been announced, it's been clearly stated, categorically mentioned that, that the government will get out of all state-owned enterprises except in a couple of strategic sectors. And in those strategic sectors as well, the number of state-owned enterprises will be limited to maximum 4. This is a very important, statement of intent, and the privatization of one of the leading companies, state-owned, oil companies, is testimony to implementation of this intent. So, last part actually, this is important just from a forward-looking perspective in terms of what you can expect from the, from the Indian government, in the current dispensation. For this, it is extremely important to remember the dynamic of reforms in a democracy, in any democracy, but especially a democracy like India, where, every 100 kilometers, the language changes, such diversity. So we are a vacuous democracy. And in such a vacuous democracy, the political economy of reform is something that has to be understood. And in that light, see the reforms that have been done. And I think this is a very important point. Whenever India has launched into reform, there are two primarily stakeholders, and I'm actually simplifying just to drive home the point, which is a vocal minority that benefits from status quo, and the farmers that are protesting. I have absolutely no doubt in actually making them part of that vocal minority. They are the rich farmers, from the rich states of Punjab and Haryana that have been benefiting from the current status quo, versus a silent majority that actually gets hurt by the status quo but benefits from reform. So it is, the silent majority does not have as much of a voice, doesn't bring its voice, but the vocal minority brings the voice and thereby pushes its very best to maintain status quo and thereby resist change. The other important aspect that has to be mentioned is that the benefits to the silent majority accrue over time. They don't come immediately. Any economic policy, the benefits come over time. In contrast, the costs to the to the vocal minority, who are typically much more educated, people who they know, and so they know their costs are immediate, and therefore that also makes them resist this far more. In the context of the agriculture reform itself, I would say these are basically 10%, and most of the middlemen who are who actually will lose out as a result. So the fact that this government has gone ahead and pushed reforms through is testimony to the fact that it is focusing on the silent majority and thereby also actually saying that the vocal minority cannot hold up, cannot be actually the be a hold up for progress of the economy and the country. And I think that idea is extremely important for you to see through the measures that are being implemented. At some stage, maybe we can also talk about because I read the New York Times and all the other outlets very carefully, I will state that a lot of what you read in the New York Times and other outlets in today's world of oftentimes of post-truth. You must actually use your own ideas and your own assessments to think about India. And I say this as not a politician. I'm an independent economist to the government of India, and so without any political affiliations, I state that in this post-truth world, a lot of what you read in the media may be very, very colored. And with that. Because that does matter a lot for the way India is viewed in the United States. So I would strongly urge you and humbly request you to actually use your own. I'm sure you have friends and family here, who will give you a much better perspective. So I'll stop there and hand the mic over back to Sumir. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian, for those excellent opening remarks. I certainly learned a lot listening to them, and hearing that ethical wealth creation is good is music to our ears as investors in India. We're big supporters and believers of that, so thank you. My first question for you, Dr. Subramanian, is you spoke about the really excellent and revolutionary labor reforms that have happened recently. And as you correctly mentioned, they've been talked about since 1991 and finally been implemented last few months. Can you give this group a little bit more color on the nature of those labor reforms and the likely impact in India? We've had other discussions in the Asia Society about some of the US-China tension. Of course, that's led to a lot of US companies shifting manufacturing out of China to places like Vietnam and India. And how is this likely to impact all of that? And what is this likely to mean for companies setting up manufacturing in India, Dr. Subramanian?
Thank you very much, Samir. I think that's an excellent question. I will keep my response reasonably short, but what I would urge all the participants is to go and read the one of the chapters in the July 2019 economic survey, which was titled, the enabling MSMEs to grow, avoiding the problem of dwarfs, and that has a lot of rich data and analysis. It was that chapter in the economic survey that made the case compellingly for labor reforms and some of the other changes that have come about. And I'll give you the basic point there. So a lot of the incentives so far, that government gives to small companies in India have actually been size-based and typically for very, very small firms. And what this has done is created this perverse incentive for firms to remain small so that they can continue availing benefits from the government. And the way one had the opportunity to, so I remember actually mentioning to the Honorable Prime Minister that, as parents, we all, when our kids learn to cycle, we do give them those support wheels. But if we were to tell the kid that you can have your support wheels for life, the kid would never learn to bicycle on his or her own. And I said that paternalistic instinct is about definitely providing those support wheels initially, but also making it very clear to the kid that those support wheels are going to come about in a few months, and that is not there for life. I think that is the key idea, because a lot of our labor laws actually, that there were thresholds, like if you're a firm with less than 100 employees, you didn't have to comply with a lot of labor regulations. And so firms chose to be less than 100 employees. So the main changes that have happened in the labor reforms, and I'll also add, the MSME definitional changes, because they're also important part of this idea. So firstly, at the federal level, there were about 43 laws that govern the employer-employee relationship, and about 1,300 sections across these 43 laws. Now, what has been done is those 43 laws have been condensed into just 4 laws. So 90% reduction in the number of laws. And the problem was that many of these laws actually had simple things like salary, wages, bonus, etc., being defined in different ways, and that just provided rent-seeking opportunities, for the inspectors, etc. Now all that has been done away with, and the number of sections has been reduced by 60%. From almost 10 different registrations that a company had to do just to comply with the employer-employee relationship, now it's been made to one, from 10 to 1. The thresholds for defining what is called a factory for firms to retrench employees, thereby to cater to demand conditions, that has been increased from 100 to 300. So any firm up to 300 employees can actually cater its employment to demand conditions any which way that it wants. It doesn't need to go and seek approval from the local government. This is important because almost 99% of firms are less than 100 employees in India, and that's a phenomenon. So collectively, and lastly, the minimum wages, and this is staggering to, something that actually I got really moved by, was we had almost 1,300 minimum wages, and now they've been reduced to 40. So compliance has been significantly reduced across all this, and that is why it's a seminal piece of reform. Last part, which is I think very important, that now flexible employment through full-time equivalent, that has been enabled. So firms can actually, have a 6-month contract or a 1-year contract or a 2-year contract, and so different industries, depending on the nature of their, of their work, employer-employee kind of duration, can cater. And that is also very important for flexibility to the, there have been also changes to the benefiting the employees, but those are primarily, for instance, bringing gig workers under the, under the ambit, providing them social security, and minimum wages, as I mentioned. So these are very seminal reforms. Last part, which I mentioned, the MSME definition, for instance, were using these perverse incentives. Now they've been changed significantly so that there is incentive for them to grow. And this is primarily done because one of the things I have believed is that India needs to produce jobs in the manufacturing sector. And by letting firms grow is how job creation will happen significantly.
Understood, Dr. Subramanian. No, that's great to hear on the labor reforms, and definitely a huge step forward in terms of simplifying labor for manufacturers. So really heartened to hear that. I have one more question, and then we're going to open up for some questions from the group here. There's a lot of audience questions for you, Dr. Subramanian. But I have one more broad question. The second major point you raised on agricultural reform. One of the things you'd mentioned in your opening remarks is sort of a small vocal minority being hurt for the benefit of the silent majority. And this clearly, it clearly seems to many independent observers to be an excellent reform in terms of liberalizing farmers' ability to contract with whomever they want and improving agriculture. So very positive. But at the same time, India is a complex country, of course, with many states and many different interests. And there have been some protests in Delhi recently that we've all read about. How do you see this playing out at the state level? How do you see the implementation of the agricultural reforms playing out? And will this bear some of the fruit that we all hope it will for India?
So again, good question. In my opinion, the equilibrium outcome that will come about, once all the dust settles on this, will be that some concessions may be given just to sort of keep the bigger picture in mind, because what has been done through these 3 reforms is providing the farmer the freedom to go and sell his produce wherever he wants, whenever he wants, because the Essential Commodities Act, for instance, which was passed in 1955, in a situation when India was a food scarce economy. Now we are a food surplus economy. But this bill, what it actually used to do, this law used to treat every storage effort as a holding and something that was actually legally, that therefore was not allowed. And that then led to a lot of price volatility because small farmer had to go and sell, couldn't invest in infrastructure. So all these reforms that have been done, it gives the freedom to the farmer to go and sell where he wants. In the previous dispensation, he could only go to what is called the local mandi and go and sell to the middleman or the middlewoman. And that middlewoman, they had actually developed a good coterie where they would make sure they would collude, and thereby, for instance, a small farmer would come in the morning, his crop would not be picked up till about 4:30, in the evening. He'll be waiting there, and so that to induce that distress sale, and thereby, so this used to happen again and again. Now, if that small farmer basically once he arrives, let's say at 9:30 in the morning, he finds that he waits 1.5 hours, and say the middleman is not buying, he can go and basically and sell it to someone else. And that competition is what is most important for giving enough value, share of the value add to the small farmer. So, this is something which actually gets me a little upset, I must admit, but this is an instance where the politics is unfortunately, coming in the way of good economics.
Understood, Dr. Subramanian. Thank you for that. Shifting gears a little bit, Dr. Subramanian, here in the US, of course, we all know we have a new administration between President Biden and the first ever Indian American Vice President Kamala Devi Harris, Vice President Kamala Devi Harris. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on how the new US administration is likely to impact US India trade and trade more generally with India, and how this is more broadly perhaps likely to affect India, this shift in administration.
So again, that's a good question. A few weeks back, about 3 weeks back, I had a nice interaction with the United States ambassador, and we discussed about this. And because to be honest, I wanted his perspective on what is the, and what I heard there was actually very heartening, I must tell you. I think in general, and while this may seem like a homily in some sense, but it is really true that the values of the United States and India, especially with the economic direction that India is taking, now far more matches that of the United States. And as an economist, as a thinker, during this COVID period, I have come to the conclusion that going forward, the World Committee of Nations is going to get sort of bifurcated into transparent democracies and opaque, non-democracies or autocracies. And I think India and the United States certainly will be those giving direction and providing vision to to countries among the transparent democracies. So I think the values and the importance of doing trade transparently. I've been reading the media interactions of President-elect Biden, and especially on China, and what he has said, I think bodes well. So I am extremely optimistic.
Understood. Thank you. And a related question. This one is from the audience, Dr. Subramanian. Can you comment on India's thoughts on RCEP, the Regional Cooperation Trade Agreement? Of course, India decided not to join. And any general thoughts on how India's trade policy is likely to evolve?
So again, I think this is an area where the nuanced perspective is extremely important. Typically, the economists have taken a binary view of trade. And I must mention that recently, Paul Krugman, none other than Paul Krugman himself, actually acknowledged that the view that economists have taken on trade has been too binary, that there needs to be, the fact that trade always actually benefits everyone. I think that perspective is certainly not entirely true. There are losers as well. I think the United States, some of the sections of the population are indeed testimony to that. I think the U.S.-China trade war is, in some sense, an exemplification of this particular theoretical or conceptual stance on trade not being, borne out in reality. So now, in that sort of milieu, what India has observed is that the trade agreements actually, and especially with some countries, they have been misused, especially through the rules of origin. The rules of origin have been abused extremely, very, very strongly. Our view and this government's view is that some of the trade agreements that India had signed earlier, during the 2004 to 2014 period, did not take into account some of the abuse that can happen. So the first point that I want to mention is that India certainly wants to, to further trade, but we want to further trade on an equitable basis. I think that is extremely important. We are the 5th largest economy in the world. We have a huge consumer base, and gone are the days when India will basically go and negotiate diffidently to any country. We basically do recognize, we now have the self-confidence to be basically saying this is what we bring to the table, and therefore this is what we want in return. Our view was that the earlier trade agreements did not bring that perspective, that self-confident India's perspective. All the countries with whom that are part of RCEP, we have trade agreements, and so. There is basically, so I don't think that a very binary view is actually, is deemed necessary here. Last point actually, and this is also something that you will find commentators and especially many Indians writing saying, oh, look at the tariff increases, that this is going back to pre-91. That is not correct. Because, if you look at the tariff increases number, there are 2 key points. One, a lot of the tariff increases have not been as much on intermediates or those that are required for production. They've been far more on finished goods. And that distinction again has to be made. This is again, not a binary discourse, but a more nuanced discourse, looking at the supply chain, in terms of distinction between finished goods versus. Second aspect is that even the tariff increases, pre-91, these tariffs average tariffs used to be about 75%. In India now, the average tariff is much, much lower. I've not recently checked the number, but easily a fraction of that. So again, this is also, when you look at the more nuanced story, any commentary that says that we are going back on trade may not be actually the true story.
Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. That's a fair point and a far more nuanced view than simply free trade or no trade. I agree with that. That makes tremendous sense. And it's a more sophisticated policy. Switching gears a bit on you, one of the several of our audience members are curious to get your thoughts on the Indian economy under the COVID pandemic. And some of them have commented that initially, because of the sharp lockdown that Prime Minister Modi instituted, our GDP growth fell much more than other countries, but subsequently it's sort of come back up very sharply. How do you see the Indian economy reacting to COVID-19? How do you see recovery? What's your outlook for 2021 on the economy as we hopefully come out of COVID?
Yes, Sumir, the answer to this question is that it's going to be a little longer because it's important. Firstly, I want to lay out the principle behind the government's response and the lockdown. Back in about February, my office started reading a lot of epidemiological research, on the pandemic, and especially we looked at the Spanish flu pandemic, which was the earlier, pandemic of this magnitude. One of the things that we gathered is that, the pace of spread of a pandemic is very similar to that of a network. And larger the network, the pace of spread is higher. And more densely populated the country, the pace of spread is higher. And that is why we actually took into account that we need a stringent lockdown. And based on the humane principle, and I actually must mention that I went and actually said, as the chief economic advisor, I will be given blame for the economic impact. But at this time, we have to focus on lives. The humane principle, and I mentioned it, that while GDP growth will come back once the lockdown is relaxed, but human lives, once they are lost, cannot be brought back. And that has to be the essential humane principle that has to drive our response. And I think, and that's where the other point I mentioned is that we have to be, we cannot be myopic in our response to the, to the pandemic. We have to, basically settle for the long run, because the Spanish flu pandemic itself almost lasted 2 years. And so this is also, and it was very clear that this is not going to be a pandemic that will go away in a few months. So we have to actually be settling for the long haul. And that is why, if you see, even our fiscal responses have been more calibrated, keeping in mind that, we do need to keep ammunition, and gunpowder dry for how long it will be. So first point, the intensity of the lockdown was much greater, and that has been reflected in the per capita deaths. Per capita deaths for India are about 8 per 100,000 people, compared to in the 70s and 80s for European countries and the United States. Now, this is despite the fact that in a larger population, in a more densely populated area, the pace of spread can be much higher. So intrinsically, India actually would have had much more deaths. Also, do remember that if you just take the pure number of people above 60, in India, there are far more than any country put together, even, just because we are such a large population. So given that, we really were facing the prospect of huge mortality, and that is something which we cannot afford. The other, point which is important is, yes, faced with a pandemic, policymakers always have to choose between, the bad and the worst. And we have to choose the bad and not the worst. Because in India, the reality is most households have 5 people, 1 bread earner, especially those at the bottom of the pyramid. And if that bread earner actually has to face the unfortunate consequence of death, then the destitution that results for the remaining 4 is far, far greater than the impact, actually economic impact due to a recession. Undoubtedly, that is, and this is the unfortunate part of a pandemic, that, we don't have the luxury of choosing between good and bad. We are forced to choose between the bad and the worst. And therefore, we place the emphasis on protecting human lives. I think that is very clear. Second point, actually, which is, I had written in the, a piece in the Indian Express after one of the former finance ministers had called into question the green shoots that I talked about after the Q1, after the April to June recovery. And indeed, there has been a V-shaped recovery. What I had mentioned was that if you plot the intensity of the lockdown on the x-axis, as measured by the Oxford University, and the GDP decline on the y-axis, India lies on the line of fit, which means that the decline was exclusively because of the lockdown. And that is what made me then predict as well that during the unlock phase, we will have a V-shaped recovery, because it had nothing to do with the fundamentals of the economy. It was basically that economic activities were restricted, and that's why there was basically a decline. So now going forward, I think the recovery has been excellent, at 7.5. And this is one of the, and some of the nuanced points there is that this 7.5% has come about despite a decline in the government final expenditure. And this is, even though the central government has kept up its expenditure, states have actually, cut expenditures. So despite the government's contribution being lower, the growth has been, has been minus 7.5. And my own internal assessment, actually, if, for instance, states had kept up their expenditure as they did in the April to June quarter, we would have had only a minus 2.5%, not a minus 7.5%. So the private sector actually is what is, is driving the growth, and investment has picked up very well. I think that is also an important, if you look at the gross fixed capital formation, there's been a 60% increase in the second quarter compared to the first quarter. And typically consumption is what actually leads, and then investments comes behind. But here investment has picked up. And I think so those portend well for a sustainable recovery. But as I had mentioned in my press conference after the second quarter's numbers, I would want to be cautiously optimistic, primarily because of the pandemic. The next 2 months are winter months here in India, December and this month and January. And, we have passed the peak in September, but if you can continue to hold and keep the, pandemic, without spreading in the next 2 months, I think, then we would actually be, and by that time, I'm pretty sure a lot of the vaccines would have started coming in as well. So the only piece of caution that I would actually, advocate is because of the pandemic. As I said, the economic impact is primarily because of the pandemic. Doesn't have anything to do with the fundamentals. And last point, which is some people also think that, Indian economy was slowing down before the pandemic itself, and that this decline is because of that slowing down. That is actually not true, because, yes, the Q4, the last quarter number was 3.8%. But when you, open the hood and unpack that, the March month was drastically impacted because of COVID. And I've written about this as well. And the month of March is the last month of the financial year. A lot of activity happens then. So just as a counterfactual, if, for instance, the pandemic had hit India in April and March was normal, we would have actually reversed that trend of declining growth and things were looking up. So I am quite optimistic. Last point, I think the reforms that we've launched now is primarily based on this understanding, and India has been one of the first emerging economies to understand this very well, that this crisis for an emerging economy is very different from previous crises. This crisis is one that can impact potential growth of the economy. And therefore, reforms were extremely critical to ensure that the medium to long-term growth prospects of the economy is not affected by enhancing productivity. And that is why we've actually focused on reforms. So overall, I think with the pandemic now and with some of the sentiment against China, global value chains, etc., moving out, among large economies, a country that can grow at 6% plus at least, once the pandemic is over, India is the only economy that can actually offer that. And I think that in some sense really enhances the attractiveness of the India story.
No, certainly, Dr. Subramanian, I can speak for ourselves as an investor. We've seen many of our Indian companies bounce back very sharply along the lines of what you're describing. And we've also, one follow-up question on the COVID impact on the economy that I have for you is, we've seen the Reserve Bank of India adopt a very accommodative stance, reduce interest rates, which has been very positive, particularly for lenders in India, financial services. But recently, we've also seen that inflation started to go up a little bit in India. And so there's been a little bit of nervousness in the markets that will that sort of force RBI's hand to increase interest rates despite the recovery that's sort of underway due to COVID. Any commentary you have on inflation and how that's likely to evolve in the pandemic India would be very helpful.
So one caveat, Samir, actually, I don't publicly comment on monetary policy, just to, ensure that in spirit, I follow, the aspect of the independence of the central bank. But what I will mention is my take on inflation. The inflation, has been primarily due to food inflation. And that itself a lot more in vegetables, which are perishable. And that has happened because of the supply side disruptions that have happened, due to the lockdowns. Even in the unlock phase, some states and especially some of the, the metropolitan areas, there have been, night curfews, for instance, to, and just to keep the pandemic in control. So this is not a demand side phenomenon. The inflation is not a demand side phenomenon. It's a supply side phenomenon, primarily because of the lockdowns. I think in the unlock phase, those supply side constraints are slowly easing. And I do anticipate that once enough people get vaccinated, etc., and we don't need any more of these restrictions, I think definitely the food inflation, especially vegetable inflation, actually will go down. The other point, and this is related to our discussion earlier, Samir, on agricultural reform, which is why agricultural reform is extremely important, because if you have, for instance, large storage, right? Even with some of the and local storage, let's say, then even with the supply side restrictions, supply would have actually at the final retail outlets would not have been impacted, and that is why it is extremely important to enable those reforms so that the market failure that is happening in some sense here that there is demand and there is, supply is not able to cater to it, would be able to be, that would be taken care of. Now, I'm not pretending that will happen overnight or even within a few months. It will take time, but it's a necessary step to enable that process. So going forward, I think that in a few months, I don't see inflation to be to be a worry, and especially because it is on the food side, and not as much on wages, for instance. Therefore, I would basically, think about how what should be the response really, on this. I think it's important to keep in mind that it's primarily coming from food.
Understood, Dr. Subramanian. That's very helpful color on inflation. Thank you. We have another question from the audience, Dr. Subramanian, on where do you see the greatest opportunities for US companies today to invest in economic development in India? And how can US companies help India achieve its economic ambitions?
I think, one of the areas that I really think the US companies can make big contributions to is the financial sector. If there's one sector that actually gets me, worried, it is the financial sector, because we have problems both on the quantity side and on the quality side. Let me explain what I mean here. And I would urge, again, those who are interested to go and read a chapter we wrote in this year's economic survey called Golden Jubilee of Bank Nationalization. So India, did its nationalization in 1969. And so last year was the Golden Jubilee. And we wrote a piece, therefore, on. So I would urge, the participants to go and take a look at, because what I'm saying, that's been covered in detail in that survey. So if you look at the credit penetration in India compared to OECD economies, the average for OECD economies is about 160%. India, that is about 52%. So we are actually, 1/3 of the OECD average. So that's the quantity part. And now this credit penetration is not that, large companies do end up getting credit, and they are the ones that end up defaulting as well on their loans. It's the credit penetration to the MSMEs, those with ideas who want to actually start companies, those at the bottom of the pyramid who want to actually buy a car, maybe build a house, people. That's where the credit penetration is far lower. So even that 52%, in fact, actually hides the nuance that there is, credit penetration at the lower sections of the, population is actually far lower. So that's one problem. The second problem is that, there is basically a lot of the credit gets cornered by the large corporates, and they are the ones that have actually, defaulted. If you look at the default phenomenon, it is primarily in the large and the medium to large corporates. So as a result, what happens is effectively taxpayer money and depositor money is going in the hands of the large and mid-sized corporates. It's a transfer effectively, of course I'm using very flattering words here to say it's a transfer. But that's the problem, where the quality of lending has not been very poor, and that's because the use of data, technology, analytics, etc., in large corporate lending has been very less. My BTech dissertation at IIT Kanpur, I had used neural networks, was an application of neural networks to electrical engineering problems. Now, within a decade or so of that, actually, companies, world over started using technologies like these in banking. And yet in India, even some simple things like, the quality of financial statement, quantitative indicators for the quality of financial statements, the disclosure of related party transactions, the amount of related party transactions, the pledging of shares by the promoter. These are all excellent leading indicators, but have not been used as much. So I think the main impetus, I would say, is to bring a lot more data, technology, analytics into the financial sector, and thereby improve the credit penetration significantly in the economy. That is the opportunity for investors and for India.
Dr. Subramanian, that's very interesting. Thank you. And certainly the financial sector in India is rich with opportunities, and that's very helpful for the audience. In the interest of time, I know we've taken a lot of your time. I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to combine 3 or 4 questions from the audience. There've been a number, as a final question here on our side, there's been a number of questions around some of the points you mentioned on media coverage today. Media coverage globally faces challenges today, and it's hard to know sometimes what to trust, what to not. But anything you could comment on that vis-a-vis India in terms of what might be types of questionable news reporting or things that we should all be more aware of as we look at news on India? Any commentary you could provide on that would be helpful. I think there've been a few questions in that area, Dr. Subramanian.
So, firstly, and this is going to be maybe a 1 or 2 minute answer. And I would request the audience to indulge me, in this. Having lived in the United States for almost a decade and coming from India, I would like to highlight that oftentimes the definition of liberalism, it's not necessarily the way in which it is seen from the lens of the Western world. I'm not a history scholar, but I've read on these aspects. That if you look at Max Weber's work itself basically links the Protestant movement to capitalistic ideas, and the Protestant movement was basically one of the separation between state and the church. And therefore, liberalism or being liberal in the Western conception is one where basically no religion. But the Indian conception of liberalism has always been very different. And this derives from our very, very rich spiritual heritage, where Indian conception of liberalism is to accommodate all religions. It's a very subtle, nuanced point, but think about the difference between 0 and 1. 1 is basically unity. Everything is in there. 0 is nothing, and in some sense, just to sort of convey this idea, I would say the Western conception of liberalism is equivalent to the 0, while the Indian conception of liberalism is equivalent to the 1. And that's where I think if that understanding is there, we basically, if you take, for instance, even the current, dispensation, if you look at the programs, welfare programs have reached one and all. There has been no distinction, on the nature of the religion, etc. For instance, in earlier times, there have been programs which basically said that the benefits that will be given to kids, school kids, will only be for the minority religions, and not just including one religion, but the majority religion actually were excluded. But that kind of programs have not been done in the, and so I think this is very important. Yes, there are incidents that happen, India is a very, very large country, but I think if this idea, this fundamental difference between, the Western conception of liberalism and the way India sees it, we have this, Sanskrit quote called Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, and the Honorable Prime Minister has talked about it many times, which is that the entire world is a family. That's the spiritual ideal from which we derive our notion of liberalism. And I think, understanding that difference will help a lot in being able to, sort of take out some color. And I will also acknowledge that I don't think, a lot of Indians themselves understand this difference very well. Given our education, which actually is, we don't oftentimes get enough education on our own spiritual heritage, on our, the heritage that we have. And as a result, you'll find a lot of Indians themselves also having a conception of liberalism, which is closer to the Western notion, but not to the intrinsic Indian notion. I think these aspects must be kept in mind when you read what you know about India, and especially in the current regime.
Dr. Subramanian, thank you for those very thoughtful and insightful remarks. I certainly learned a lot today. The audience really appreciates it. Let me hand off to our Executive Director, our leader, Margaret Conley, for closing remarks. Margaret, please.
Thank you, Sumir, and thank you, Dr. Subramanian. Fascinating conversation. We've been wanting to do more programs on India, so thank you very much for your help with that. Asia Society is hosting global virtual programs around the world, including from our center in Mumbai. They are all open to the public, so you can check out those list of global programs at asiasociety.org/online. We're a nonprofit. We're approaching our year end. Our mission, as we just heard towards the end of the conversation just now, is about building bridges between the United States and Asia. And it is so important right now. So if you're willing and able to support us, please consider making a donation. You can go ahead and do that at our website. One program coming up that you're not going to want to miss is our Future of U.S.-China virtual conference on January 14th. We're honoring our honorary chair, George Shultz. He's turning 100 years old next week, and Dr. Henry Kissinger will be there as well, and you can go ahead and sign up. You can follow everything that we're doing on Instagram and Twitter using the handle @AsiaSocietySF. For those joining our VIP reception, please click over to the second link that was emailed to you right before this program. You'll have private time with Dr. Subramanian and Sumir there. Thank you again to Chevron for sponsoring us. Thank you to Ty for being a promotional partner. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our team. Thank you again to Rexel for diligently chasing down Dr. Subramanian to make this happen. Pilar, Jamie, Michael, and our interns, thank you. And from all of us at the Northern California Center, stay safe.